Good morning. My name is Larry Bailey. My mother's name was Ruth Bailey Clattenhoff from Los Angeles, Texas, in LaSalle County. Today is October 26th, 2019, and I have the great privilege and honor to interview Miss June Gebert. June and I met many, many years ago when I was a young boy, and her husband Kenneth, and I got to meet more her youngest son Carrie. But today's interview is all about Miss June. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, or a number of questions, and feel free to elaborate and tell as many stories as you wish.
Well, feel free to stop me when you want to.
What is your full name and where were you born?
My full name is Leila June Franklin Gebert, and I was born in Fowlerton, Texas, or I'm not completely sure, but possibly 4 miles out in my grandparents' home on the farm.
And what year were you born?
1928.
What is your earliest childhood memory?
I'm not sure about the earliest part of it. Might have been about being on that farm, because I dearly loved my grandmother, and I can remember just almost jumping through the window when we got close to her house. But my earliest was just a kind of a freedom, I guess, in a little country town, and actually where we lived was almost like a little country farm in a little country town. So my earliest memories were of the old-fashioned way of living, I guess. And I don't remember how far back that went, because, I just can't say at 5 I remembered so-and-so, because I really don't completely know the age. But it was a feeling of comfort, I know, and of being safe, and knowing that I was loved and taken care of.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
Actually, by the end of our production, there were 7 of us, 6 girls and a boy.
And what were their names?
Well, the oldest one's name was Louise, Ruby Louise, after my mother. The next one's name was Mary Lee, and she is here. She's only 19 months older than I. And she's kind of suffering a little dementia. And the third one was I. And then after that came Maddie Bell. She was named after our grandmother, whose name was Martha Bell, but she didn't like the name, so we called her Maddie. Or I didn't call her that, but that's what she liked to be called. And then there was Doris, who is still living here in Catula. And then we had LJ, who was the only boy, and then 2 younger sisters who are 15 and 12 years younger than I. And one of them is Frankie, and one is named Bonnie. Actually, Frankie Darlene and Bonnie Ray.
And what kind of things did you do for fun when you were a kid? Quote.
Well, actually, we were a little bit limited. People would think so now. We ran a lot outside and just played, and I did some acrobatics with a cousin that I had. We had a good time with that. And I did a lot of reading. I was a big reader, and so that actually took a lot of my time. But we just did what came to us for fun, I guess. I can't tell you exactly what it was, but we just ran outside and played. We didn't have TV. We didn't have telephones with games on them. We just found what we could to play and be happy with.
Did you have any horses or livestock?
Yeah, oh my. As I said, we actually lived on a farm inside a little town. We had milk cows, we had pigs, we had horses, maybe 1 or 2. We had, what did we have? We had chickens everywhere, which was a little bit unhealthy sometimes when you were stepping in things. But we had all of them. We had all the animals there were. And I, even as a young thing, I was very young when I learned to wring a neck of a chicken.
So you did have some chores.
Oh,
did you ever milk a cow or?
I think I told you earlier, I was just adored my father and was right with him every minute. So when he milked a cow in the mornings, I was right there to, let me help you, let me learn how, Daddy. So he let me learn, and then he brought in an old cow that was gentle from the farm, and I milked that cow. And I was so sorry I learned to milk because he went to work in the store real early in the morning, and often he got up and said, "Junebug, I have to go to the store early. Would you get up and milk the cow?" And I wondered why I learned. But I'm glad that I did. It was another experience.
So where did your father work?
Well, my father actually worked on the Low Ranch. You may be familiar with the Low Ranch in Zella, outside of Los Angeles. And for when I was a child, he worked there. And then about the time I was 10, he went to San Antonio and worked in the stock pens, the old livestock pens. And after that, he was working for Zachary as a carpenter, as it put in some airfields during the war. So he worked several places. But he did work when I was milking the cow. He was working at the store, which got him up early and put me out milking the cow.
And your mother, did she
My
have...
mother was absolutely a home. My mother, as I look back at my mother, I think the wonders of what she could do. She literally drudged at times, raising 6 children, and the husband having to work away from home. We washed on a washboard. My sister and I would come home and shell corn for the pigs or whatever needed it, and then mix chicken feed for the chickens. Yeah, we had a number of chores. I always wondered why that was happening. Other kids didn't have it, but then other kids didn't eat as well as we did either.
What were your parents' full names?
Well, my mother's name was Ruby Lee House Franklin, and my father's name was Leo Jerome Franklin.
Do you know where they met?
I don't know unless it was, my dad was raised in McMullen County in Christine and in that part of it. And my mother was raised around Hallettsville in that area. But then he was kind of a wanderer, her daddy was. And they came down and I think they bought a little farm. And that time they had house dances, and the best of my knowledge, they met at one of those house dances. But there was 15 years apart in their age, which was not unusual at that time. But I just remember my father's joke was, because he was 31, and he said, "Well, by the time I got to be 31 and met this 16-year-old girl, I was tired of kicking them off. I had to just go ahead and marry." So anyway, it was a long, happy marriage, I guess. I mean, marriages then were meant like they were when I married, meant to last forever, and the husband was absolutely in charge of the household. Of everything. Not in my case, but in my daddy's case.
So when you were young growing up, what was your house like? Could you describe what your house looked like in the rooms, etc.?
It had, let's see, a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen, and then it had built on the outside a little screen, not a little, but a rather large screened-in porch, and then one bedroom where we all slept in that. No, I mean, not my mother and daddy. They had slept out on that screen porch. It was like a bedroom, but we all slept in the same bedroom. And as I told you before, I slept between 2 other little girls, 3 in a bed. That was before the little girls came along, and the 2 older sisters had the privilege of just having 2 in a bed.
Did you always...
But the house was one of those, it was not a 12-foot, but it was a 10-foot high ceiling. And it had all the beaded lumber in it. And the reason that they were able to buy it was because my mother had an old aunt who had left her money when she died, and they bought the house with that, or they would not have had the house probably. I just remember about the house, when I ate my breakfast in the morning, I was denied makeup until I was grown. And so as I went out the door of my bedroom, there was a door, and as I went by my dresser, I swiped my lips with a little lipstick and went out. I'm sure I looked like a clown. My dad thought only street women wore makeup.
So I had asked earlier about your parents' names. What were your grandparents' names?
Well, my
On
mother's
both sides.
name, their names was Mattie Woodhouse, which is rather strange, and the grandfather was Samuel Walter House. and the other side was, I really can't, his name was Frank Franklin, but I don't know the name offhand, I can't remember it. And my grandmother's name was Melvina Walker.
Were both sets of grandparents from South Texas as well?
Oh yes, I think their relatives came from like around South Carolina or somewhere, but they were all born and bred in the counties.
So,
In fact, there's a little, I'll have to tell you this one. I had a friend that told me that one time he didn't think one time, but he had gone to nearly every place that he could think of, all over the United States, Australia, South America, Alaska, and he had never gotten off a plane or a train that someone didn't walk up to him and say, "Aren't you from McMullen County? I'm a Franklin and I used to live there." So they were pretty scattered.
when we were talking about your parents, could you describe their personalities, who they were,
Well,
their behavior?
my father was raised evidently more or less, or all of his instincts came more from his father. His mother came from a rougher set of people, but his father evidently came from sort of the genteel people. And he was very, very careful about being courteous in his language and very low key, never did any punishment, but could make you feel very bad if you misbehaved without punishment at all. Just, you wanted to please him. He was one of those people that are with me. I just had an adoration of him. And my mother was a little more dynamic. She was the one that administered the discipline and the rules. Well, no, I guess not all the rules, because you lived by the way the father thought you should live, and you even ate the way he thought you should eat. But she was the one really in charge of us. And I was telling my sister not long ago, as much as I adored my father and loved him, when I went away from home and was homesick, it was my mother that I needed, not him, because she was always the one that took care of us.
What about church? Was church an element of your when you were growing up?
Ever. You went to church by the time you were 4, you were sitting on those little chairs in the nursery and hearing those stories. And I was praying by the time I was 5 or 6 that I would die before my grandmother did, because I loved her so. I didn't know what it was all about. But I do remember that. Now, my mother was raised in the Church of Christ very, very strictly. And she saw to it that we never missed church. But she did not always go, and I'm sure part of it was that she never really had the clothes, because, we're talking depression. And she also was very strict about no kind of behavior. We were not even allowed to sew doll dresses on Sunday, because that was working. But then she got us ready, sent us to Sunday school, stayed at home and cooked 4 chickens for dinner that day. It was dinner, not lunch then. And you know what she called that? Comes from that very religious background. That was the ox in the ditch. But we were all fed very well on Sunday by the ox in the ditch. So church was a very important thing, and the rules of the church were very important growing up.
Could you tell us some stories as we think about your parents and the lives they lived? Some good stories that you recall about your dad and mom, either separately or together.
Well, with my father, he was just such a low-key man and so gentle. And so with him, like I've told you before, I had such an adoration that it was almost like a worship with him. And when he died, I was 35 and had about 6 weeks before my last child came. And for, I guess, about 2 years, I couldn't stand his picture in my house. I couldn't look at it. It hurt too bad. And I would dream at nights that he was hurting or sick and I couldn't help him. And it would just nearly destroy my whole day, or would, of course. And I have to tell you this because I don't know if it was what do they call it? When you get the little thing that comes to you and tells you I had the word not long ago, but I've lost it. Anyway, I dreamed one night I went into their house, And I looked, and he was sitting in the kitchen on his old cane chair in his U-shirt, drinking coffee, and smiled up at me, and I couldn't get in there, but it didn't matter because he was perfectly comfortable and happy, and I never had another dream. Now, I don't remember what you call that, but I wonder if it was that sometime or if it was just a time to quit mourning. But anyway, that's the way I loved him. And when my mother died, I remember I was then, of course, well into my 40s, but I remember my first thought about it was, I'm an orphan. And my second thought was, I cannot bear for my children to someday hurt like I'm hurting now. So, you know, there's just so many things that come to you in your parentage, and your own parentage and the parentage of your mother and daddy. But anyway, my mother grudged. I look back now and think, I can see her we all worked, you know, we washed on the washboard, and we killed chickens and to eat, and then we scalded in and picked them, and before we ate them and before you cut them up, it was just a very, well, a little bit crude at times, but never something that you didn't enjoy. In fact, we just did not have treats like, you know, like kids have now. About once a month we might have a cologne when you paid the bill, and you ate candy like it was just never going to be, you're never going to get it again. But my mother, I can see her now outside in her yard with an old straw hat on, and she's sweeping an old yard that you couldn't grow grass because the water was saline. But she would be sweeping, and she would be whistling the whole time. I can see her in her kitchen, washing dishes in a dish pan, not a sink, with water she had to heat on a wood stove, but she was singing while she did it. So evidently it was a satisfying life for her, although she drudged the whole time. And I wonder if I would be able to do that. You know, you don't see that much anymore to people. And you don't see that kind of contentment a lot. Mm-hmm. And my dad just did his job. He just was one of those people that did things exactly right as he thought it was. And if he wanted a snack, he might have a piece of an old cold biscuit and a sliced up onion and just be perfectly happy. Drink a little lemonade at night. I never saw him drink. I remember, though, that I always wondered about it, because if we had a cold or a cough from somewhere, there was a little bottle of whiskey produced, and it was poured over some sugar, and we did that for a cough, but we never saw that bottle again. So we were raised rather rigidly. And my mother and daddy, of course, brought that on, and I've always looked back and thought everybody should have that kind of mother and daddy that raises you with those kind of scruples and that kind of thinking. I don't know that I've held on to it as tightly as I should, but I was raised that way.
When you were growing up, who was the oldest person that comes to mind, either a family member or somebody outside the family? And could you describe what those characteristics were that attracted you to that person?
Well, I was not necessarily attracted to this person, because and I have to admit, it was my grandmother on my father's side. She was rather a harsh person. She didn't have that element of love and affection like so many did. And she, I don't know, she had teeth. I'm sorry, I have to say this, but I always thought of her looking like a witch. But she had teeth done many years before, and she never wore them. And they all had this aquiline nose. So when as it went along, her nose and her chin nearly touched. And she did, as I say, she was not an emotional, loving person. So I did not have the best impression of her. But she was the oldest one that I knew, and she was 90 when she died. That was my daddy's mother.
Hmm. So as you were growing up, could you describe for us your school days, where you went to school and what the schools were like, the students were like?
Well, we were very lucky in our tiny little town that it had begun with the idea that it was going to be a large town. So we had a lovely school, a two-story brick building, up on a hill about a mile from my home because they thought that was going to be the center of town at the time. So I walked. I remember when I first started, by the way, I think I wore coveralls to school at the time, and my dad walked with me. We had a little, it was about a mile away, and we had a little, what we called a footbridge that went over just a little stream just before you got to the school. And the building it was just, for a little town like that, it was just marvelous. It was, the bottom floor had 4 large rooms, and then there was I guess the Low Ranch got that. I think they bought it and put it into some buildings on their ranch. But there was a beautiful old staircase that went upstairs, and then there was an auditorium, stage, and 2 rooms for them to teach in. And then when I started the school, it was, you just sat very, you just behaved very well. You were quiet and you listened and you studied. Except I remember that when the teacher said, "We will have no talking in this classroom," it never occurred to me that I couldn't say the things that were important to me. And so I found myself a few times standing in a corner, weeping. And then, of course, when everybody went out to recess, she kept me inside and held me in her lap. So it was not a very rigid kind of classroom. But we had some excellent teachers. Actually, you didn't have to have the education you have now. You just had to have some kind of a teaching certificate. And we had some very good teachers. I remember that. And I always enjoyed school. In these big old buildings now, I remember being sometimes a little bit bored, and I would look up and count how many tiles were at the top of the ceiling while everybody else was studying. But actually, it was a very good system. With upstairs was high school. We had some high school, and as I told you before, I was lucky enough to have a pastor that had kind of come down there because he was recovering, so it was understood, from alcoholism, and he taught me. And there was only 2 of us then in the high school. That was my sophomore and junior year. And I told you before, we went through about 7 different languages, the roots of them all, and learned it all. And if we were having a lesson in Spanish and we came to a very difficult word, well, we would go through the root of that word and find out what it meant. If we were studying the history and we came to a very well written sentence, we stopped and had a English lesson or a language lesson. So I really had a tutor for about 2 years. Everybody was not that lucky to have that, but we had some good teachers. We never had anybody that was really a bad teacher. It was a good education for a tiny little town.
Outside what I'll call the academics, did you play any sports, or were there any extracurricular activities?
I tried to play, yes, there was some. I didn't do much of it. I tried to play baseball, and I never could hit a baseball. I do not have hand-eye coordination, so I was not very good at any of it. We did have some, because I remember they all came to Cotulla once a year for what was called the county meet, and there was basketball and baseball. And then at one time in there we had a 6-man football team, but I don't remember much about that because I was pretty young. I do remember we had someone that moved in there, and she did cheerleading, and I'd never heard or seen anything like that. I was fascinated by that when she'd give her little cheers. But we didn't get too far out of our place, out of our little town.
So you walked to school? Is that true?
Yes, every day. Actually, we came home at noon. We had an hour for lunch, and we came home at noon, and we walked back at noon and had lunch, and then walked back there again to school. So we got lots of exercise.
So when school was in session, were there 5 days of school?
Yes.
So if you could please, describe a Saturday and a Sunday. What were the weekends like?
Well, first of all, you did the laundry, and that was on the rub board. We all participated. There were just plain old big aluminum, I guess they were aluminum, some kind of tin wash tubs that we used, and you scrubbed and then you rinsed twice, and you had a little bluing that you put in there that made the clothes whiter, because I remember one event when my sister and I were just indignant over having to do that. I guess we wanted to do something else, so we deliberately put too much bluing in it and had all blue instead of white, and we had to pull them all down, start all over. So we never did that again. Sometimes you get a little indignant. Well, and then we had lots of time to play. I did, as I say, I love to do little acrobatic things with a cousin of mine, and I can remember that mother telling us we were going to turn her liver over. But we just played outside. I don't know exactly what we did. I can't think offhand. I know we did have a great big old barn out there, and sometimes with the younger days we made playhouses out of it and played out in that barn a lot. And then at one time, my dad brought home a little half Shetland pony for us, because I have a very definite remember. It was named Dan Moody, which was one of our governors long ago. And I remember his putting all three of our older girls on it. And I was on the back, of course, because the two older. And I was crying and scared, and my mother standing on the porch saying, "Mike, get her off the horse." And he saying, wait a minute, Susie, wait a minute. And in about 10 minutes, I was loving every minute of it. So he was right. But there was just, and we rode that horse as we got a little older. We rode that horse a lot. And one of those things I remember about the horse is that we were not allowed to get out of a trot. This was a young man that just loved Kenneth better than anything in the world. But I said, one day Kenneth had just gotten out of the hospital and he was all swollen. We were at a cookout, big old fair here, and Kenneth had to wear his laced up shoes, and every time he went to the bathroom, Ace followed him and took care of him. And I said, "Ace, why do you love him so? He's just so coarse and ugly sometimes in his way he talks to you, and his language is bad, and why do you love him so?" And he said, "Well, the first time I met Kenneth, I was on handling a construction crew on a highway, and he stopped to get a drink of water. And before he left, he had told me how bad the employees were, that they did no work and the taxes were wasted. And I went home and told my wife, I hope I never have to talk to that old SOB again as long as I live." And he said, "You stop down there at that little place." We all met at Max's, and said, "Kenneth's in there and he's telling you what he thinks about you and everything else. And when he leaves, you know that he's not going to talk about you, because he said everything he could to you already. And you also know that if there's anything wrong, he's going to be the first one there to say, 'Can I help?'" And he said, and I thought this was a beautiful accolade. It's just nice to do business with an honest man. And I thought, what a nice way to go. But at his funeral, one of my nephews looked back and said, "Aunt June, there's 4 blocks back from here, cars are still coming out of that church." You never saw such a rain. Well, I mean, they just ranged from every kind of people in the world that came out of that church. Everybody wanted to be a honorary pallbearer. It was really beautiful to watch. But I do remember also growing up in that Baptist church, and all of us did, and my grandson leaned forward and said, we were at the Episcopal, and said, "My mom, Papa would not like all this ceremony." And I said, "But Papa would expect this. He grew up in the Lutheran church. This is the way they buried people." And anyway, he was a different kind of man than most people were, and it didn't always show, but when you knew him, there was a love and a depth in him that was really kind of amazing. And the thing about Kenneth was that he was not raised that way. There was not a lot of affection or anything in his family, and certainly not, it was not a genteel family, and he certainly was not genteel, but he was the most kind and loving man I think I ever knew. He had little childish tantrums at times, but there was never any kind of threat there, and there was never any kind of violence. There was never any. I would talk ugly to him when I was angry, but not under any circumstances would he talk ugly to me and say bad things to me. And he was way more affectionate. I do remember, and I have a very guilt feeling about this, his saying to me once, because I was such a mother and such a housewife, and he would say, you know, I don't care if there's food in the refrigerator, I don't care if it's on the table, I don't care if there's furniture and dirt and everything in this house where I have to move it to get around. If you would just sit down and talk to me and act like you're glad to see me when I get home. Do you think I don't have a guilt feeling about that one? I never had time for that. I was too busy being a mother and a housekeeper. But he was a good man. He really was a very good man.
So if you could help us understand when you think about what you thought of our country back when you were growing up, and you've seen it change. You came through the Depression. You know, you had FDR as the president, and then number of presidents obviously since then. You know, if there's any one president, fine, you can focus on that. But what is it about national changes that you think you've seen in your lifetime that are just astounding to you?
Well, I actually, if you want the actual truth, I have paid almost no attention except during the war. I was taken by that because we had people in it and we heard about it all the time. But I never paid that much attention to what was going on, except as I look back and I think about, I am, as I told you, I'm a bleeding heart and a giver. And so I was always more impressed by those times that we were really, when we really helped the poor and do what we can to take care of people. But I can't just offhand name one president. I was very impressed with Jimmy Carter, of course, because he was such a good man, but he really didn't have the qualities to make a good president. But I was impressed by him as a person. And even those people like Bill Clinton and Kennedy, you know, they did good things and they had such good qualities, but in other places there were not good qualities. There were places that you had to question. So I really don't know. I didn't pay enough attention, if you want the truth, to just draw big conclusions about it. I just like people taken care of. That's mostly the thing you did in the morning was to get the house completely clean, and you also did the laundry. And any ironing, it might be done with a flat iron, might I say. That's the only thing we need. No, we did have some kind of little pumped up irons that were, I can't remember what they were like. I think they were gasoline or kerosene, I don't know, but somehow you did have that, but we didn't have it. But we ironed with a flat iron, and when that was done, well, then you were able to read or do what you wanted to do. And as I said, that cousin and I used to kind of do a lot of outside running and playing. And I guess you just kind of did simple things of playing, you know, whatever came to you at the time. I remember if we would have made, excuse me, I'm stuttering. We had that one time we had made a little stove out of some kind of trash thing out in the dump. I don't know how we got it. But then you would also take tuna off the cactus, and if you could get the thorns off, well, then you put that in jars and canned it. And sometimes you got some cotton and put it on top of your stove and made biscuits when you browned each side. If you didn't set your fingers on fire, you just did whatever you could do, mostly when you were playing. You didn't have a lot of toys. I do remember, though, that Daddy always saw that we had a red wagon. And I always thought, wasn't that nice that he, every Christmas, or not every Christmas, but when we needed to, we got a big red wagon. Well, as I look back, that wagon, more than used for play, was used for gathering mesquite beans for the horses and the pigs and what have you. So he saw to it that we had the wagon for lots of good things. And things like that, I don't remember just exactly what we did. I just know we made do most of the time. And as we got older, we read a lot. and sometimes visited friends.
What was it like when you finished your chores or you're playing with your friends and you came in to have dinner? What was dinner like at your family dinner?
Well, we had a very narrow menu. Most of what we produced at the farm, like my mother canned, and so she had canned veg. We had canned vegetables. We had corn a lot because everybody liked corn in different ways. She had ways of making corn and also making it where it, one thing she did was beat up eggs and put it with corn as it was cooking because it made it a whole lot, there was a whole lot more produced there. But there were just so many things during the Depression that you did to make things work better and last longer. But we had macaroni, we had corn, we rarely had meat. If we had meat, it was pork where we had killed a hog, or my grandfather had killed deer, or he had fished. But mostly it was things that were produced out of nature that we ate as far as meat was concerned. But we always had vegetables, which we didn't like because they were canned and saved from the farm. We did like corn at all times. We could eat it off the cob, fried, whatever you did with it. We loved the corn. We had beans nearly every day. My mother got up and put on that was our protein. My mother got up and put on a pot of beans like you would brush your teeth almost. And we had it for nearly every meal. I mean, not breakfast, but dinner, lunch. Let's say we didn't eat lunch, we ate dinner and supper. And that's what we ate. Had the beans every day. And just whatever was available mostly. We didn't do a lot. Well, we had to buy flour. My mother made a wonderful, wonderful biscuit. And there was not a better food in the world than my grandfather's venison backstrap stuck in one of her big old crusty biscuits. So, it wasn't like we didn't eat very well, but we ate very simply. And that's as much as I remember about the meals. I always ate well. I liked it. Whatever it was, I liked it. But the beans were always there. And very often the macaroni. But our macaroni was not cooked with cheese. We couldn't afford cheese. My mother put a can of tomatoes in the macaroni, and that's what we ate when we had macaroni.
So when you were sitting down at the dinner table, supper table, maybe even the breakfast table, how did you find out about local, state, or national news? Was it discussed, or was there a radio? How did you find it?
My dad listened to it, but we were never interested. I never knew any of it. I mean, I was not at all. I was grown before I ever listened to a newscast or anything. I do remember when World War II started that we did listen. And I remember also about that one that when war was declared, we had an assembly and listened to it on the radio. And also when they drew the first enlistment number, remember, you won't remember, but the first enlistment number when they started drawing people, what do you call that?
Draft.
The draft. When they had the draft, and the first time they drew the numbers, that came on over the radio. And when they pulled the first number, there was a yell, scream from the background, and they said it was the lady's son's number. And I always wonder if that was staged or if that were real. Because, they said it was real.
Right.
But that was just things we did. That was not a Saturday, and I kind of moved away from that, but I just got thinking about that. But we just did what came to us. A very simple life. Our playing. Now, we played house when I was very young. We had the barn, and we set up little playhouses back in there and played in there. But as I got older, we mostly just read during our leisure time.
Where did you go to high school, and what classes did you like more in high school?
I always liked literature best of all. I still quote Shakespeare. I still love it. I can't remember anything else, but I remember Shakespeare. Well, our classes were just general. They were literature, or rather they called it English, mathematics, history, and Spanish, sometimes, not always, not every class. And then we had typing. We had regular classes mostly. And then I did high school 3 years in Fowlerton. And then I came over here and graduated in Cotulla, stayed with a family that we had known forever that had lived in Fowlerton.
What year did you graduate from high school?
1945. There were 30 of us in the class at the time.
Where did you go on dates? Describe a date to us.
Well, a date, mostly you went to movies. And sometimes if there was a party, which wasn't too often, you'd go to a party or a dance. But it was not the most exciting things in the world. But it was mostly movies when you went.
What did you do after high school?
I graduated at 16, wasn't 17 until August. And right after that, in September, I went to San Antonio and started business school and worked half day at where my sister worked as a telephone operator, which so many people wouldn't even recognize now because you had to plug things in and out all the time. So I did that in receptionist on half a day, and then went to business school half a day. And I just did that 2 years, and then I came back to here and married and lived in Los Angeles, Texas.
So, who did you marry?
I married Kenneth Gebert from Los Angeles, Texas. That was 12 miles from where I lived before. And he was a beer drinking Dutchman, and I was a country Baptist, so there was a little turbulence in the marriage, but we got through 51 years of it. Not ever quit loving each other and caring about each other.
So was his side of the family from Los Angeles, or?
They were I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were a group of people that came from around not Temple, but Taylor, Texas, and it came down. It was like they advertised, and they even brought them down in trains to show them Los Angeles. I think his grandfather bought the ranch that we still own in 1923, and that was when they came to Los Angeles. Till then, they had lived up around Taylor.
So, could you give me some insight as to what Cotulla was like when you were here after you had gone to San Antonio, you came back and you were married, you lived in Los Angeles? How long did you live in Los Angeles?
Well, we lived there, let's see, we married in 1947, and we moved to Cotulla in 1962 because the girls had gotten to a point where they were involved in everything and were having to come back and forth anyway. And I was at that time secretary of the school. So we moved to Cotulla in 1962.
So what was Los Angeles like from 1947 to 1962?
It was, we had a reservoir next door to us where we could have a swimming pool. That wasn't bad. But otherwise it was mostly just a little small town with just little houses here and there, and people were pretty much in touch with each other, but there wasn't a lot of social life going on. Your grandfather's wife and I, his third wife, we were good friends, and we visited a lot, and then there were some young people that I knew, and we visited, but mostly there were some dances sometime. There was we called it a beer joint, or we called it a cafe. It was more beer joint than cafe. But there was a place there that served food, and they would have dances. Actually, my husband's parents had built it, and had fixed a dance hall out in the back. So that was about the only real entertainment that there was in the town itself. Anything we went for was Cotulla. You went for dances there, and you went for movies there. Los Angeles.
What was the name of the facility there in Los Angeles? Was it Ruby's by chance?
No, not then. Ruby's didn't come till many years later, and she was actually married to my husband's brother. But Ruby's has been there, oh my, so long now. I can't even remember when they built that place, but that was not the one of the original ones. It was actually a Gebert's restaurant, the one I'm talking about. They're the ones that built it, and she cooked, and they did serve. It was mostly people went there for the beer drinking and entertainment, but when they wanted a good meal, they went and got it from Miss Gebert's restaurant. But they still were farming. They held on to the ranch, and they farmed more than they ranched. I think they had there was a cultivated area, and then there was a ranch area. So they did a lot. They did mostly of the ranch. I mean, the cultivated. They did most of the farming, than they did of the ranching.
So when you moved to Cotulla in the early 1960s, what was Cotulla like?
Well, actually, I have been here 3 years. It will be in February. And it has changed since I've been here. So from the time I got here in 1962, I don't know exactly how to tell you how much change there's been. The old courthouse, they've just redone it, but they haven't rebuilt it. But it's been there for many years. And Cotulla had, well, one thing about Cotulla was that it was very, well, what am I trying to say? It was it was very racial. The Hispanic people mostly lived on the other side of the tracks, and they had a school that they went to until they could speak English. And there was no, as far as on our side, when I say our side, the Anglo side, there were restaurants where you could buy a hamburger for maybe 15 cents and a drink maybe for a nickel. I know you could go to the drugstore and get ice cream cones for 5 cents, because I took my children on the last ride into San Antonio when the train used to go through here, and they insisted we go to the dining room, and I was horrified when I paid 40 cents for a scoop of ice cream. Anyway, we had everybody just knew everybody like they did even in the smaller towns. And the schools were, actually I got about almost the same education, but in a different environment than I did in Fowlerton. The teachers were very good, of course, but I think my very favorite was always literature, always English. I love grammar also. But I do remember taking geometry. I was a math student, and I remember that first 3 weeks I was so lost. I thought, oh, what am I going to do? I have to have it. I'll never learn it. And all of a sudden it opened up like a flower, and I knew everything there was about it. But that was my hardest subject I ever took. I was a rather good student because I enjoyed it.
So when you moved, did your husband's occupation change from when you lived at home?
He had become, by that time, he had become well, he took care of all wells, kept them working, and kept all the book work on it. So he was able to do that and just come back and forth to Cotulla just as easily as we did Los Angeles. So nothing really changed much except where we lived.
Okay. With Kenneth, how many children did you have, and could you give me their names in order of birth?
We had 4, and I had my first one about a year after we were married, and her name is Linda Lee, named after both grandmothers. And then the second one was Darlene, and her name is Doris Darlene, named after 2 sisters. And 10 years later, I had a little boy, and his name was Kenneth Gebert Jr. I remember that Kenneth had said he did not want a child named Junior, name it something else. 30 minutes after his born, I said, Kenneth, are you sure about that? No, I guess we'll name it that. So he became Kenneth Gebert Jr. And then 3 years later, which was the same distance between the 2 girls, I had another little boy, which we named William Kermit, which is a strange name, but one of my brother-in-laws just kept insisting that I name him after him, and his name was Oscar, Kermit Oscar. And I said, well, I wouldn't name a dog Oscar, but I'll name him Kermit, but I won't call him that, so we still call him Carrie. And then the William came from the other brother, so we had to name them after that. You don't hear that like we did then, but we named all our children after somebody at that time. But each child, it was very strange that the two girls were 3 years apart and the two boys were 10 years behind them, but they were 3 years apart.
And you have how many grandchildren now?
I have 8 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. Quite a family.
And they are living.
Well, my oldest ones live here. One of them lives in town, and one of them lives. The boy lives here, and the girl lives in Lytle, where my daughter Linda Lee lives, her mother. And then the others live around College Station, all in that area, in Spring, Texas.
Did your children go to college?
One of them finished. The Ken Jr. finished. He got his degree. Kerry became a playboy when he went to college. So, one time, not been quite a while ago, he told me, "I still have that mean letter you wrote me." And which one was that? The one when I stopped going to school, and I said, "That was not mean, that was just the facts." It said, "I'm not putting my money down a rat hole anymore, go get a job." But Darlene went for a while. Linda Lee did not. She married very early, right after out of high school. And this is kind of a funny little thing that doesn't mean anything but to us. But as I told you, my husband was a beer drinking Dutchman, which you knew. And one time he came home, and Linda Lee was going with the man she's married to, and he had some jobs over there, and this boy's parents had a filling station, and inside had a little bar where they sold beer, and he would stop by and drink a beer or two as he was on his way home. Well, he came home, and something was wrong, and I finally said, "Kenneth, did something happen on the job today? What's the matter with you?" And he said, "June, are you going to let Linda Lee keep going with that Kinsler boy? He's been out there drinking beer all the time." What's good enough for the wife's never good enough for the daughter. That's just an off story.
So when you think about your life, and there's a lot to it, and we haven't gotten to certain things, what do you consider to be some of your more significant accomplishments?
Well, I think maybe the fact that Kenneth and I were able to work out being as different as we were, that we were able to work out a kind of living arrangement where we were able to live together and love each other and care about each other for 51 years. And I don't know that you would see that right now. You don't see much of that. Mm-hmm. But that, and the fact that all my children grew up to be very good people, and as I told you about Carrie before, they were even loved their mother and thought he had a little sense and accepted some of her advice. I think that was good, because that doesn't always happen. And the fact that I've been able to live 91 years, and I really give that to God's grace, because I don't know how else I would have made it through the world if I hadn't had that to hold on to. And that's about as much as I can think of that I have accomplished. I've done nothing very spectacular.